so that Diane can share her screen. She's up in Sandpoint today with the Sandpoint class site. Great, I can see your screen, Diane.
Make that bigger.
They're seeing this screen. Oh. Yep.
And I can start to hear you all as well.
So you can hear me all right?
I can hear you all right.
Okay, well,
Okay,
good morning. It's my turn.
it's your turn.
We've got sunshine in Sandpoint today, which is North Idaho. When the sun comes out, you really notice that golden orb in the sky. I think it'd been about 6 weeks since we'd seen it, so it's nice to see. I know the bare ground is starting to show, so we're starting to sit down and start planning for planting time. Let's see, arrow down is not working. I'm gonna get this. I'm always a little slow when I start out. Still not advancing. Here.
Let's see. Let's make sure we're in the right.
Gotta hold the mouth just right. So I'm gonna use here, not the arrow.
Yes.
Okay. So we make our living from what we grow and sell on our farm. We are on after, I just realized today that it had been 30 years since we've been doing this. My gosh, I don't know how that happened. It was just the other day. So it seems like it, but here we go. Oh, that didn't work. Yeah, we're challenged a little bit here. Just hang on, bear with me, I'll get there. There we go. So one of the things that we do on our farm, we do a fair amount of on-farm research, and I think an important thing for you to do as whether you're starting out or have been farming for a while, is to really consider being a little bit of a scientist on your farm and look at different things. Keep a clear observer's eye with how you're doing your crops. We're always comparing different vegetable species and comparing yields. We did a research project with U of I a few years ago, really looking at the same species, cucumbers, eggplant, and peppers, comparing yields grown in a high tunnel versus a hoop house, just to see if that was a viable comparison. And we found that some things grew as well in the high tunnel as in the hoop house. And the goal of that was really looking at the cost of a high tunnel versus the cost of a hoop house. So we're always looking at comparing things, and I can talk more about that later. We also do a fair amount of on-farm research for working with graduate students, which has been a great way for us to learn. Having entomology students come to the farm has just been a wonderful resource for us. And over the years of learning more about the beneficial insects that we have on the farm, the students coming really help us with that. So that's another part of looking at what we're doing and taking a closer microscope of what's happening on the fields. So a little introduction of who we are. I talked a few at the last session about assessing. We grow quite a diversity of vegetables, and it's changing all the time. I could add to this list with strawberries, blackberries, grapes. We've added table grapes, we have juicing grapes, and we've added elderberry, aronia berry, and goji berry, which have been a good crop for us. And we're always changing. Nature has things changing all the time, so we're always changing, and we're always trying different crops and working through that. The hops we've mainly grown because my husband makes his own beer, and he likes to have organic beer, and it's more cost effective for us to grow our own, but we also sell dried hops. And our newest enterprise just in the last couple of years has been, we've always grown and saved our own flower seeds, And we just started growing with Snake River Cooperative out of Boise, and you'll hear from Casey later. And we're just doing a few seed crops for them, but we're happy to have that be a new enterprise for us as well. Planning for your field or garden layout is one of the most challenging aspects of vegetable production because there's so many goals to be accomplished in the plan. Crop rotations, planting dates, time of maturity, duration of harvest, microclimates, all these things have to be considered. And you need to know the recommended crop spacing so you can calculate how many plants will fit. It's a complicated exercise, especially considered that it can change every single year, and it does. So you need to design your plan in a way that keeps in mind that things are always going to be changing, so you can plan for the future. One technique that we have found that's really helps us is keeping good records, and Greg talked about that, and that's really crucial. If you're just starting out, of course, you don't have anything to reference with, but start out keeping those good records, and that's going to make a difference. We are certified organic, so because of that, we're required to keep a lot more records than you might, but I kind of think that even if we weren't certified organic, that we would be journaling and tracking things as we do, just because it makes every year go smoother. The more information you have this year to apply to next year and the next year, the better it's going to be. So record keeping is a crucial part of that. As Greg was talking about, tracking your production for future expansion and really looking at different aspects of how long it takes to plant and weed and transplant. Greg was talking about doing a stopwatch, and we will, I won't use a stopwatch, but we will go through a process of trying to keep a close track of just if we weed one bed, I'll pay attention and make note of what that takes me so I can look at it for the next time, and just for evaluating and planning each one of our days of how much we're going to do, and thinking about what it takes to grow that crop, and going through the process. The more you keep note of that, and I've said before, we always keep a little notebook, so we're keeping track of things. That really makes a big difference, and the more you write down, the better. So I keep a journal. Every day I'm taking notes as I go through the field. At the end of the day, I go into my computer in a Word document and I just make note of things. But things that you want to write in your journal, certainly, and if you don't do a journal, you could even do it just on a calendar and make notes on a calendar so you can track that. I mean, we can track all the way back to 1990 of what things are doing, and that really helps us see how our last spring and fall frost have changed. Looking at our, I'm not going to read these things out, but looking at all of these things and being able to look at every single year, we're certainly noticing a change in the climate. The change in our frost dates have changed considerably. And if you're not tracking that, you're not going to remember one year to the next. So that's important to be doing that. Greg mentioned growing what you like to eat. And the point of that is, if you're going to be marketing what you're growing, you want to like what you're growing. And you go to the farmer's market, and people are always going, your customers are going to be asking you, what do you do with it? How do you eat it? And if you say, well, I don't like it, not likely they're going to be buying that. I know kohlrabi was something that we grew one year, and we put it on our CSAs, and people were eating the leaves and throwing the kohlrabi away. We learned that we needed to be a little more diligent with growing only things that we like. Thinking about who's going to do the work, of course, that's an important part of it. And we've talked, and we'll continue talking about assessing your market and really thinking about who your customer is before you plant, looking at all those different aspects. Seed selection, that's one of my favorite things to do this time of year. And know that not all seed catalogs are created equal. If you think about, if you're buying seed from the middle of Missouri where it's hot and dry or hot and humid and bringing it up here, it's going to take a few years for that to adapt. We're always trying new seed varieties, and when we do, we often will trial them. We'll trial everything for 3 years to see how it works. If it doesn't work well, we'll move on to do something else. But it's important to think about when you're making that seed selection, thinking about what the criteria is. We have worked with a lot of restaurants and a lot of caterers over the years of doing this. These are patty pans, and we had a caterer that we worked with for 15 years. That patty pans were an important part of their catering. She'd stuff the patty pans with quinoa and some kind of sausage. She'd do some savory dishes with them, and people love them. And the size of those are pretty small. Those are like plum size. And to any of you that have grown squash know that they are only plum size for like 2 hours before they get big. So looking at identifying what your customer wants is a really important part of that. And there's, like I said, there's many variables that come with every seed packet. So really look at that seed source and think about what crops are going to require season extension, and do you have the infrastructure for that season extension. There's a lot of different directions you can go for using season extension. If you're, as far as for growing your own seedlings, do you have a small greenhouse? Do you have a means of starting those up? When you're making seed selection, really important to be thinking about flowers throughout your garden. The Xerces Society, I can't recommend these two publications enough. They really have changed how we do a lot of things in our gardens, and we have more flowers growing intermittently through our vegetable gardens now to invite the pollinators and beneficial insects, and it has made a considerable difference in our production, creating more of a beneficial insect habitat. It's funny how many people come to our garden and go, "You've got flowers everywhere. Why do you have flowers in with your vegetables?" Well, obviously it's for the beauty of it, but it's also for creating a habitat to encourage those beneficials to come in. Thinking about how much you should plant, you might want to start with a single planting of a crop and find out how well it grows under the conditions at your site. The fact that you want to grow bananas in North Idaho might not be the best bet, so you might want to try that before you go for it. Like I said, we usually try a new variety out for at least 3 years to see how it'll grow for us, and a lot of times it's just not going to work out, but try it out. You're looking at a garlic crop there. When you're thinking about how much you should plant, it's really important that you think about how much time you're willing to invest in that. If you plant 60 zucchini plants, what are you going to do with the harvest? And when you're thinking about what to plant, you need to think about what's involved with harvesting the crop. I had a student in my organic gardening series years ago that looked at what we were doing, and she saw that we grow 64 zucchini plants, and she thought, well, first year garden, she'll just plant 32. I'll just plant half of what Greentree Naturals is doing. And when I went to visit them later in the summer, they had zucchinis that were about 10, 15 pounds a piece, stacked up like cordwood along the side of the garden. And when I started laughing, they were asking me, well, what's wrong? What's wrong? Well, the thing with zucchinis is they grow a lot. We all know that have grown them, but for us growing 64 zucchinis, we'll never grow any more than that. And with that, we're harvesting squash every single day to keep them 7 inches. That's what our chefs want, is the 7-inch zucchini. And it can go from 7 inches to a foot long in a very short period of time. So you need to think about, can you keep up with that? So we grow 32 in undercover and 32 outside. So we have an extension with that. So it extends the season on both sides. And early in the spring, we often have to hand pollinate in the hoop house before the bees are there. And it gives us an earlier crop. And thinking about, along with that, as far as the labor, I mean, there's my husband bending over for the thousandth time in a day. So that's really an important thing. And it's difficult to be realistic with your time investment when you don't know how much time it is. And that goes back to what Greg was saying. That's the main reason for tracking that when you're starting out, so you have a perspective of just how long it takes you to pick 100 foot of beans. Because we track that, I know that I will never plant any more than 300 feet of beans, because we want to keep everything that we can manage. We do have people come and volunteer on our farm, but we want to keep it to what we can manage pretty much by ourselves if we can. The important rule is everything will take longer than you think it will. Always, always. When you consider the time, energy, and space requirements for each crop before you plant, and that's not always an easy thing to do those estimates, but when you're starting out, that's why it's really important to keep good notes. Pay attention to that. Think about the estimated harvest dates and how they're going to overlap. Because there's a point where when the bean season, usually the beans season comes on about the same time that the garlic is ready to harvest, which is about the same time that the eggplant and the peppers and the tomato, everything comes on at one point. By the time you get to the first week of August, it's harvesting all day long. I mean, in the spring, we're spending a part of every day preparing and getting things transplanted in the ground. And then as we move forward with that, pretty soon everything's ready at once. So you have to really be diligent and contemplating not only what's going to happen with getting the seed in the ground or the transplants in the ground, but the follow-up of how you're going to get it out of the ground. So this is a nice, neat chart of just keeping track of our pounds. So you can see that we grow multiple kinds of beans, and this was a trial, so we were trialing different beans, so we were keeping the different varieties separate, but that's what our harvest records actually look like. I know there's a lot of programs and spreadsheets out there. We still, when we're in the processing shed and going through things, our hands are dirty and wet, and we just write it down on a spreadsheet and keep track. And since we're certified organic, that's an important part, that they want to see this. But for you, you need to know how many pounds of beans did you get out of that 50-foot row or 100-foot row? And were you able to keep up with it? I know a first-time small acreage farmer that planted 5 acres of beans that all came on at once. Well, he wasn't able to keep those harvested, I can tell you that. In deciding what to plant, you really need to look at your growing area, and I'm sure you're all starting to take a really close look at that and look at the space that you have in the garden and see what will fit. I can guarantee you that no matter how large your garden is, no matter what size your garden is, you will run out of room. Every year with 2.5 acres in production, even with our maps, there's always a point where we run out of room. It just happens. So that's really an important thing to start looking at. And thinking about what will require season extension is a really important part of where your location is, what your microclimate is. We always make a base map. We have a main garden, a south garden, and a west garden. we make a clear on a piece of grid paper. I'll make a blank map and make multiple copies so that I can sit down. Like probably this week we will sit down and with that blank copy next to the last year's copy, and the first thing I'll do is go through and look at my crop rotation, and I'll start looking at evaluating and assessing where things are going to go. It's really nice to have those maps and row numbers so that, and especially if you have, if you're keeping track of things, it's very, the bigger you get, the more difficult it is to reference where things are. So getting some row numbers out there is a good way to do it. I know that's one of the reasons why researchers like working with us, is because we have row numbers and maps and we can designate areas, and it's easy for us to find our way. And when we have people working on the farm, it's a lot easier to be able to direct them there too. Thinking about transplants or direct seed. We transplant probably at least 70% of the garden. And a part of that is we know that our transplants are, it kind of allows us to do some succession planting in that we can direct seed and transplant. So we have two different age groups going there. The seedlings that we transplant can be more resistant to insect and pest pressure because they're stronger, and the pests always go after the weakest of the species. That's nature's way. So starting out with the strongest seedlings that you can come up with is a good way to go. And with the seeding, it's easier for us to keep a seed bed moist in the greenhouse in a seedling flat than it is in the field at some point, but you also need to have the infrastructure to do that. But there's a lot of different things that you can do to create a growing environment for starting seedlings. It doesn't have to be a greenhouse. I mean, when we first started out, I think I used an old kitchen table and screwed some lights underneath it and threw plastic over it, and that's what I did my seedlings in. So necessity is the mother of invention, always. We seed our lettuces and beets every 4 weeks to keep them going through the season, which there's always a point where we kind of get a little bit behind in that, but moving forward. Here's some seedlings, transplants ready, lettuce transplants ready to go out into the field. And it's a good way to be able to compete with the weeds using the transplants as well. So we do that as much as we can. For season extension, we tend to think of season extension mainly for frost, but we do it for heat as well. We use a lot of shade cloth because we go from, in the north part of the country, we go from frost every day through May to 90 degrees in June, and so we use shade cloth. We've created a shade house in the past where we just shaded the whole structure, the whole lettuce bed, just as an experiment. We only did that for 1 year because it was the low tunnels seemed to work a little bit better for us. But it was nice. There's lots of different types of shade cloths and different things that you can use. The rule for, in my workshops that I do on the farm, I always tell everyone, always plan for the coldest, hottest, wettest, driest season in recorded history, and you're ready to become a market gardener in Idaho. The thing is, no matter where you live, Mother Nature has a way of challenging the growing season. I mean, you get things, you get those little seedlings out, and that's a picture of a hailstorm that happened the day the seedlings went out. And there's times where we've transplanted broccolis out that were the same time and season that we've planted them out many years before, and then it drops down to 19 degrees overnight. So you just plan for it, and using season extension will really help you adjust to whatever the weather brings in your garden. And there's a lot of different things you can do for season extension, and you just need to be planning for it. If we want to we use hoop houses, and if we want to grow things out and get things out in our hoop houses earlier, we'll cover them inside the hoop houses. We do not do winter growing. We have way too much snow where we are to bother with that, and we're not into growing in a greenhouse. So we might get our peppers and eggplants and things out and cover them up with a frost cloth like this and be able to get them out 3 or 4 weeks earlier, just to save us some time as we get pushing into the transplanting and planting season. So planning with a crop calendar, I'm sure you've seen all kinds of information. There's a lot of things that you can find online as far as different programs. I just use a basic calendar. I keep things as simple as possible. I spend way too much time on the computer as it is, and counting back from the last frost date. And the thing is, knowing that your frost date is going to, I'm seeing that it's changing after this many years of planting. Things have changed a bit, but really looking at, I just did my seeding calendar the other day, and we will start seeding the second week of March in going through the process. So I'll just get it on my calendar. You can see I've got 12 weeks till frost. I'll start with the frost date, which is, I keep it at Memorial Day for us and count back from there, and then using the information on the seed packets to set that up in place as far as when I need to be seeding things. If you're doing a small garden, you don't need to start everything. It's okay for you to support the local growers, the farmers market, and buy plants from them if you're only going to do a few things and you're going to trial a few things. So I think one of the things that new growers often do is trying to do too much, looking at too many. So start small, keep good records, and just see what you're physically able to do, and experiment with what will grow well for you. So we're getting ready to seed all of our brassicas, which we usually do first, so they can move out into a hoop house. It gives us more room, but that has kind of changed because we put up a 120-foot greenhouse recently, so now we have room. So that's kind of, that timeline is changing for us. We very much track our seed starting, how many we start with, when we're seeding, tracking all of that as far as what's seeded, what's transplanted, and we do sell a fair amount of seedlings in the spring now that we have the greenhouse, so that's kind of changing for us. Here's kind of what my seeding and transplanting records look like. That's a pretty important part, that you keep track of that and keep track of different varieties. I'm moving through this fast, but just to save the time, it's really important that you experiment with different varieties. Sometimes for season extension purposes, or extending the season, not season extension, I'll grow 5 different kinds of cabbage that mature. One matures at 48 days, one at 68 days, one at 78 days. I'm planting them all at the same time, but I'm harvesting them at staggered periods of time. And we're always trialing new varieties to see, oh, look, I'm already out there, to see, to see what works for us. I think it's really important that you pay attention to taking good notes, track everything, move through that. And remember, it's supposed to be fun. It's not, gardening is a labor of love, for sure. If you don't have a passion for growing food and gardening, you need to do something else. But I can tell you that after 30 years of being a market farmer, we still like it. There's never been a day that I go and open that garden gate and I'm not happy to be going and opening that garden gate. So that's really a pretty important part of it. If you have a passion for this, you'll be able to be successful at it. But start small. See what you can manage. Don't start out with 64 zucchini plants. Don't stack your zucchinis like cordwood on the side there. You have any questions? I moved through that.
Okay,
fast.
great. So if your sites have questions for Diane, please go ahead and put them in the question and answer box. Okay, we have the $1 million question. What is your most profitable crop?
That's between garlic and tomatoes. We have been saving our own tomato seed for, I don't know, 15 years. And we have these tomatoes that are 1 pounders, 1 pound a piece. We actually had a ton of tomatoes out of 120 plants. That's a lot of tomatoes. And garlic is something that garlic is the only crop that we ship all over the country. And garlic is one thing that is crucial when I know a lot of people up here in particular look at garlic because it's anywhere between $10 and $20 a pound for sale. But each bulb is handled one bulb at a time for cleaning. That's how we clean it, one bulb at a time. I don't know any mechanized way of cleaning it, and part of it is making sure that it's a perfect product. So we do ship our garlic all over the place. We years ago had an opportunity that we met someone that came to our farm who was grew herbs for Alice Waters restaurant, Chez Panisse in San Francisco. And I sent them some of our garlic to take back to give to Alice Waters as a gift with a little note saying, "Dear Alice." The chefs we work with tell us that our garlic is some of the finest they've ever had, and we'd love your opinion on it. So I got back a letter with Chez Panisse letterhead on it saying, "Dear Greentree Naturals, indeed, this is some of the finest garlic we've ever had." So that was a pretty good plus. And in the early years, I gave a copy of that letter out to anybody that bought garlic from us because there's a lot of garlic growers. So that was a part of us creating a niche for a specialty item that even though there's 10 other people selling garlic at the farmer's market, people would still come and say, "We're only buying from you because you're Alice Waters approved." So I'd say tomatoes and garlic are probably two big ones. Everybody loves tomatoes and everybody wants big tomatoes. So.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question we have is, do you need a nursery license for selling plant starts or cut flowers?
If you're selling your plants at a farmer's market, most farmer's markets have an umbrella nursery license for under, I believe, I want to say $5,000 of sales. So if you go, or maybe it's $1,000 of sales, I think. So since we have recently retired from the farmer's market, we have had to buy a nursery license to cover our sales on the farm. So I'd check with if you're selling at a farmer's market, find out if they have a nursery license that umbrellas your sales. Otherwise, it's an amount, I believe it's $1,000 for having to have a nursery license. And for flowers, I do not believe there's a license required for that.
Hey, thank you. We have a few more questions. Another production-oriented question is, where do you get your organic hops rhizomes?
What was that?
Where do you get your hops rhizomes, your organic hops?
Oh, the hops.
Yes.
We've had the hops for so many years that I don't remember where they came from. Probably from fellow farmers. I can't really answer that. 20 years ago, I could have answered that, but we do sell rhizomes, but from time to time. But can't help you with that.
Okay, thank you. What types of cover crops do you grow?
We were just talking about that earlier. We have experimented with a number of different types of cover crops, but in recent years, after an on-farm research study using mighty mustard as a trap crop for Brassica fleet beetle, we realized when we turned that trap crop under, that it was really of great beneficial resource for us. So now we pretty much only use mighty mustard. And we've been experimenting with a lot of different types of mustards that they provide. And we like it because it will germinate in just about any kind of weather. It will take a frost. It grows quickly and creates terrific biomass for turning back into the soil. It inhibits weed growth, big plus. Last year, for the first time, we used it as a living mulch in between our garlic beds, and anywhere that we've planted it, we've noticed that the weed suppression is improved. So I'm a real supporter of Mighty Mustard, and they mightymustard.com or org, I'm not sure which it is, and you'll see when you go on there, I'm quoted all over their website because I really support what they do, and I love their product. And we've gone through experimenting with all kinds of cover crops, and now mustard is the one that we do. So as soon as our garlic comes out, the mustard goes in. As soon as any crop goes out, we plant mustard. Sometimes we cut it and leave it lay. Sometimes we cut it and do a minimal till of putting it back in the ground, but the bees love it. Soil loves it.
Great. We'll make sure to have that website linked on the resources section of the student webpage.
Yep.
Great. Another question is, what's your timing schedule for tomato production?
My timing schedule, does that mean when do I start them, or?
I think it's when do you start your seeds? When do you plan to transplant?
It's a little different every year, but I think this year I would probably start seeding tomatoes the second or third week of March, somewhere in there. I don't want them to get too big, because the bigger they are, the more challenging it is to get them in the ground. But and we usually start harvesting first tomatoes in some of the varieties. We grow determinants. We just started growing a couple varieties of a Bonner variety and a Sandpoint variety that the university gifted us to bring to experiment with. They're determinants, and we're growing them inside a hoop house, and those were ready maybe the end of July, 1st of August, and the other tomatoes are just starting to come on then too. And one of the things that I might not have mentioned, and in marketing, I'm always talking about less for more, smaller quantities for a higher dollar amount. We have come to realize that over time, that in a lot of situations, growing less can yield you more if you give the plants a little more space. We tend to try to cram everything into the space that we have. And you think about it, nothing grows in the shade of something else. I mean, I don't like wearing tight shoes, and I don't think the plants like being tight in the soil, crammed up against each other. Last year, we grew half as many tomato plants, and our yields were very similar as the year before. Now, that's a combination of what the weather was doing. There's always so many factors. It's So it's consistently inconsistent, and know that to be true. What happened last year with your crops is going to be different this year because the climate is changing, no matter how you look at that. But with the tomatoes, we definitely saw that we had increased yields with less plants. So we'll try that again this year and see if that repeats. And we'll try that again next year. And if it stays consistent, that's great, because tomatoes are a big crop for us.
Great. Have you ever tried microgreens?
I grew them for myself in the wintertime just as an experiment, and that's as far as it went. I like
Oh,
eating them, but there's quite a few people doing microgreens here now, and I think they have a lot of potential. A lot of people like them, but have grown them for myself, and it was too, it just wasn't for me.
okay, great. It's good to know what you want to grow and what you don't, what you like, what fits your operation and your time.
Yep.
And then as you often talk about, like what's already in the market, that it's not going to benefit you to add more to that, into what might be a saturated market.
Yeah, that's always important to look and see. I mean, I was talking with the folks here in Sandpoint about that, and that's something, assessing that and really looking at what's out there and doing something different. And sometimes it's hard to come up with something different because there's so many people that are doing farmers markets these days, but it doesn't necessarily have to be different, but it needs to be unique to you. And like the stir fry special, I talked about that in before the session before that I did, and that has, I don't really do that anymore because we're not selling at the farmer's market. We're just at the farm stand, and the farm stand is a different clientele. Although a lot of my farmer's market people have come there, as we assess and adjust from not doing farmer's market to just doing farm stand, we've got some changes to make this year, and we've got some evaluations and reevaluations to do of how much we grow and how we will change things to adjust to this new medium of selling and marketing our wares and what we grow. So it'll be different. It's always different. You can count on that.
Okay, we have time for one last question. How many staff, volunteers, or how much labor support do you have on your farm?
Oh, that's a funny question. We have one volunteer that comes for 3 hours 1 day a week. That's it. Tom and I have been doing this long enough that we have found a rhythm to what we do. I never hurry for anything. At this point in my life, I'm one with the turtles. It's just slow and steady. We get things done. A part of what enables us to be successful at meeting our accomplishments is every day at breakfast, when we look out over our field. So we sit there and make a list of what our priorities are. And then as we go through the day, of course, that list expands, and at the end of the day, a lot of those things that were on the list get moved to the next day. But we're always establishing priorities. We're often looking at and establishing those priorities, looking at what is most important, but a lot of it is about letting go. I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Japanese term of wabi-sabi. It's the perfection of imperfection. And people come to our gardens and some people just see the weeds. Well, yeah, we have weeds. I'm okay with that. I mean, we spend a portion of every single day weeding. The zen of weeding is a very satisfying thing. I mean, we weed and mulch, that's a part of the routine, weed and mulch, but there's always more to do than there are hours in the day, and that's okay. So it's mostly Tom and I, and Tom just turned 71 yesterday, and I'm 67. We love what we do. It's not like, oh my gosh, I got to go to the garden again today. You have to have that attitude. I mean, yeah, we could hire people, and on and off over the years, we've had interns and apprentices and mentorships with different groups of people, and we do have people intermittently come and volunteer, but we have one volunteer that comes 1 day a week for 3 hours, and she interned with us 6 years ago, and she volunteers for tomatoes. So her work exchange is to get 300 pounds of tomatoes, which she turns into sauce, which she then gives us tomato sauce back. So it's a pretty good trade. So that's how we do it.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for sharing how you do your planning for planting, your expertise and your experience over time. It's really valuable for all of our participants in this course. And if you would be willing to stop sharing your screen, I will share my screen and we'll talk about what's coming up next.
And thank you for the opportunity to share.
All right, so thanks so much, Diane. At your local site, you're going to be able to take what you just heard and start doing activity number 2, which is planning for planting. We will reconvene on the webinar at 11:50 Pacific, 12:50 Mountain for our last presentation before lunch. So we do have this activity and one more presentation between